Good evening and welcome to Rage in Literature. Tonight I'm going to be talking about how books can help you with rage and anger rather than actually talking about books that are about rage. So I'm going to be thinking about what books you might want to read if you have been feeling really angry. And I'd love to know if you have any recommendations as well for books that you think might help people who have anger issues. I have been meeting people experiencing rage recently, and I had a bibliotherapy client who asked me about what books might help with rage and anger in literature. And so I've been thinking about that topic, and I'm going to share a few books with you, which I think would help. I would also love your thoughts if you have any books that you turn to maybe when you are experiencing rage or anger or fury or frustration. So I'm going to start by reading to you a little bit from the novel Cure, what we have as our cure for anger, which is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I'll just read you, probably not the whole extract, but what we say about The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Oh yeah, I remember we wrote it like a kind of parody of the way it's written. I love these ones that we did because even after 84 consecutive days of going out in his boat without catching a single fish, the old man is cheerful and undefeated. And even when the other fishermen laugh at him, he is not angry. And even though he now has to fish alone, because the boy who's been with him since he was 5 and whom he loves and who loves him has been forced by his family to try his luck with another boat, he holds no grudge in his heart. And because on the 85th day he goes out again, full of hope. And even though when he does hook a big fish, the biggest fish that he or anyone else has ever caught, and it pulls on his line so fiercely that the skin on his hand is torn, he still lets the fish pull him further out. And though he wishes to God that the boy were with him, he is grateful that at least he has the porpoises that play and joke around his boat. And even when it's been a day and a night and another day stretches ahead, and it's only him and the fish, and there's no one to help, still he keeps his head. And even when he's been pushed further than he's ever been pushed in his life and he begins to feel the edge of despair, he talks himself round because he must think of what he has and not what he does not have, and of what he can do with what there is. And though his hand becomes so stiff, it's useless. And though he's hungry and thirsty and blinded by the sun, he still thinks of the lions he once saw on the beach in Africa, like some sort of heavenly vision, because he knows that there is nothing greater or more beautiful or more noble than than this fish that that tugs him ever on. And even when it's dead, and the sharks come to feast, first one, then half a dozen, and the man loses his harpoon and then his knife in his attempt to fend them off. And even when he's ripped over the keel of his boat to use as a club, and even though he fails to save the flesh of the fish and the ordeal leaves him so tired and weak, he's nearly lost himself. And even though when he finally makes it to shore, all he has left. Where am I? Even though when he finally makes it short, all that is left of the fish is a skeleton. He accepts what has happened and is not broken or angry, but goes rather gratefully to bed. That's The Old Man and the Sea. Um, that was a kind of parody that Susan and I wrote in the novel Cure about The Old Man and the Sea. And it's actually great to reread it because it reminds me exactly why I love that book so much. And I do feel like that snippet from the novel Cure does give you a really good idea of why The Old Man and the Sea is a brilliant cure for anger, because it is written in this very hypnotic and rather repetitive voice. I'm going to read you a bit of the real book now so that you can compare our parody to the real thing. But I would particularly recommend reading it to yourself or listening to the audiobook read by Donald Sutherland, the man himself, who is an absolutely brilliant actor, as I'm sure you know. And he reads The Old Man and the Sea completely compellingly and hypnotically, to the point where you are absolutely sucked into the story. And it is a beautiful story. It is really sad, incredibly frustrating. You would expect the old man to be absolutely enraged, furious, and dying of anger and fury. But in fact, he's resigned to his fate and he does keep going. And he is an inspiration for that reason. So I'm now going to read you a bit from the real book, the very beginning. The Old Man and the Sea. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he'd gone 84 days now without taking a fish. In the first 40 days, a boy had been with him, but after 40 days without a fish, the boy's parents had told him that the old man was now definitely and finally Salau, which is the worst form of unlucky, and the boy had gone at their orders in another boat, which caught 3 good fish the first week. It made the boy sad to see the old man come in each day with his skiff empty, and he always went down to help him carry either the coiled lines or the gaff and harpoon and the sail that was furled around the mast. The sail was patched with flour sacks and furled. It looked like the flag of permanent defeat. The old man was thin and gaunt, with deep wrinkles in the back of his neck. The brown blotches of the benevolent skin cancer the sun brings from its reflection on the tropic sea were on his cheeks. The blotches ran well down the sides of his face, and his hands had the deep creased scars from handling heavy fish on the cords. But none of these scars were fresh. They were as old as erosions in a fishless desert. Everything about him was old, except his eyes, and they were the same colour as the sea, and were cheerful and undefeated. So that is the beginning of The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, which is our cure for anger in the novel Cure. And I think it is, of course, as me and Suze wrote it, a brilliant cure for anger, because it does make you feel that in the face of circumstance being against you, there are always other ways to look. And that's the message of quite a lot of the books that I'm going to be talking about tonight, that you can see the positives in a situation and choose not to be completely enraged. So I'm just going to turn to rage, which I just want to see what we've got for that in the novel Cure before I talk about other books, which I've been thinking about more recently, because this was written back in 2013. And by the way, anyone here this evening, do tell me if you've got any great books that you think are really good for dealing with anger, rage, or fury. So here we have Rage in the novel Cure. And the cure we have is Cry the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. Rage consumes. It is the hottest, fieriest emotion there is. Your vision turns red and you cannot think logically. You become a tsunami, wreaking havoc on everything around you. You don't care what you destroy. The problem with giving vent to your rage is that you not only might hurt yourself or someone else, or break something valuable to you, in the event of which, see broken china, but your rage will frighten those who witness it, and may make those who love you feel unsafe around you. Moreover, rage is deeply exhausting and wounding to the soul. Repeated outbursts will deplete you, leaving you a little more broken, a little less noble in heart than before. It should be nipped in the bud at its first appearance and before it becomes a habit. Our Cure, Cry the Beloved Country, is a novel about a man who has more reason to rage against the world than almost any in literature, told in language that soothes and calms. It shows by example that even when confronted with the most appalling calamity, like the old man in the sea with his fish, it is possible to contain your rage and choose a different way. There is there is a lovely read. What am I saying? Sorry. There is a lovely road that runs from Ixopo into the hills. These hills are grass covered and rolling, and they are lovely beyond any singing of it. So, with the beguiling lyricism inspired by the language patterns of Zulu, begins this deeply moving account of a country parson's search for his errant son, Absalom, in Johannesburg. It's 1946, and Johannesburg is a frightening place for Stephen Kumalo. Unlike in his native village, Nudot Cheney, where every bus is the right bus, there are countless ways to lose oneself, both morally and physically. Following one word of mouth sighting after another, the gentle Umfundias parson and his wise friend and colleague, Msimangu, discover that Absalom, like countless other vulnerable black discriminated against young men in South Africa during apartheid, has been swallowed up in a criminal underworld, and by the time they find him, it is too late. The boy has shot and killed a man who, to complicate matters, had devoted his life to campaigning for the rights of the black underclass. The Umfundist is forced to watch his only son stand trial for the murder of a widely admired and respected man, and we in turn must watch Kamalo become more and more bowed and frail as his heart breaks under the enormity of his grief. There is no happy ending for Kamalo. Instead, what Alan Paton gives us is an extraordinary evocation of one man's endurance through suffering. Kumalo thinks and acts slowly in the slow tribal rhythm into which he was born, and Paton monitors the old man's emotions as he struggles against his rage and grief with each new assault. Sometimes his rage wins out, for Paton's characters are nothing if not human, and Kumalo submits to the desire to wound with words. But he is always quick to remove himself and later to go back to apologize. Pride the Beloved Country is a novel about having the courage to say what needs to be said, about apologizing when rage wins out, and about how hard and bitter words do not lead to a resolution, but to more anger and hurt. Kamala's sufferings will put your own in perspective. Peyton's language will quiet your raging soul. And the wisdom of Peyton and his cast of suffering characters will show you how it is possible to live with your pain and even to laugh again. So that is our cure for rage in the novel Cure. But I do have quite a few other cures to mention tonight, some of which were written since the novel Cure was published. So, one that I think is a really great cure for rage is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. And Kate from the from the book review podcast. Sorry, I still haven't worked out how to turn around my camera to get the titles the right way round. One of these days I'll do it. So, A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles is a really fantastic book, which I think is a great cure for rage and anger, because our hero in the book has every good reason to be in a rage, but he chooses to stay cool. So, on the 21st of June 1922, Count Alexander Rostov, recipient of the Order of St. Andrew, member of the Jockey Club, master of the hunt, is escorted out of the Kremlin, across Red Square and through the elegant revolving door of the Hotel Metropole. This hotel. Deemed an unrepentant aristocrat by a Bolshevik tribunal, the Count has been sentenced to house arrest indefinitely, but instead of his usual suite, he must now live in an attic room while Russia undergoes decades of tumultuous upheaval. So, this is about a man who is a count who's used to living in the lap of luxury, but he is confined to a very small room in a beautiful hotel. And the joy of the book is that the Count makes the most of his confinement and is eternally grateful for what he has and doesn't rage against the world, but instead makes new friends, has adventures in his hotel, even though he's there for 30 years. Outrageous and crazy. And it is a really fun, great, brilliant read, which I totally recommend. I bet that a lot of you have read it because it has been an absolutely huge success. I did find it took me a bit of getting into. I didn't get hooked immediately. It probably took me about 50 pages before I did get in to the book. But I would absolutely urge you to read it if you haven't read it yet. Get past those 50 pages and then you'll be completely absorbed. And I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. And I'm just going to read you a little bit. Oop, poor connection. To get into the feeling of the writing if you haven't read it. One of the other things that I love about it is that there's a lot of really wonderful descriptions of food and drink because the Count, being an aristocrat, has had a lot of amazing food and drink in his life, and he's a great appreciator of the fine things, and he manages to still, even though he's confined for years on end, and he's not meant to be getting luxuries, he still manages to get them somehow. Here we go. This is a nice little section near the beginning. Having acknowledged that a man must master his circumstances or otherwise be mastered by them, the Count thought it worth considering how one was most likely to achieve this aim when one had been sentenced to a life of confinement. For Edmond Dantes in the Chateau d'If, it was thoughts of revenge that kept him clear-minded. Unjustly imprisoned, he sustained himself by plotting the systematic undoing of his personal agents of villainy. For Cervantes, enslaved by pirates in Algiers, it was the promise of pages as yet unwritten that spurred him on. While for Napoleon on Elba, strolling among chickens, fending off flies, and sidestepping puddles of mud, it was visions of a triumphal return to Paris that galvanized his will to persevere. But the Count hadn't the temperament for revenge. He hadn't the imagination for epics, and he certainly hadn't the fanciful ego to dream of empires restored. No, his model for mastering his circumstances would be a different sort of captive altogether, an Anglican washed ashore. Like Robinson Crusoe stranded on the Isle of Despair, the Count would maintain his resolve by committing to the business of practicalities. Having dispensed with dreams of quick discovery, the world's Crusoes seek shelter and a source of fresh water. They teach themselves to make fire from flint. They study their island's topography, its climate, its flora and fauna, all the while keeping their eyes trained for sails on the horizon and footprints in the sand. It was to this end that the Count had given the old Greek 3 notes to deliver. Within a matter of hours, the Count had been visited by 2 messengers, a young lad from Mur and Mirelais, bearing fine linens and a suitable pillow, and another from Petrovsky Passage with 4 bars of the Count's favourite soap. Very important when you're confined for 30 years. And the third respondent, she must have arrived while the Count was at dinner, for waiting on his bed was a light blue box with a single millefeuille. And then the next chapter is an appointment with the girl that he has summoned. So this is a really fantastic book, which I would utterly recommend as a book that will very much cure any angry, rageful, furious thoughts that you might be having, because it's all about looking beyond your immediate circumstances and finding places to go in your head that are better. And talking of which, I would like to next mention Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hessian, which is a really lovely book, which is the opposite of rage. It's a very gentle, quiet, beautiful book about 2 men in their 30s who live very quiet, thoughtful, pensive, and interesting lives. They are best friends with each other. They look at the world differently to many people. They use humour, board games, and silence to steer their way through the maelstrom that is the 21st century. That's what it says on the back. And that is very true. I absolutely love this book. I think it's a really great one that everyone should read. It's the story of a friendship between 2 men. It does have some really sad moments. They live with, one of them lives with his mother. The other one, just trying to remember, it's been a while since I read it. I think one of them, the mother's died and he's inherited the house, and the other one lives with his parents. They get together once a week and they play board games. And There's an element of mime in the book, which is really interesting as well. And the mime, which is obviously a silent activity, takes on a great significance towards the end of the book. There is a bit of a love interest going on, but it's not a book with huge dramas. But it's a book of great, gentle humour, and it takes you on a journey with Leonard and Hungry Paul. It's going into the life of the mind and into the life of creativity, and it very much equips you with the tools to escape from rage and anger. So that's one which is definitely there for your armory. Then I've got a few more that I want to bring in. It's difficult to know on what order to mention these, because I think it's important to mention that humour is a great way to tackle rage and anger as well. And um, regular visitors to my bibliotherapy sessions will know that I love Tom Robbins, and Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins is one of my favourite all-time books. Still Life with Woodpecker is one that I don't tend to mention so often, but I also absolutely love it. By the way, I'm listening right now to Tom Robbins' memoir, Tibetan Peach Pie, which is a really good read and a really good listen, all about his somewhat unlikely and at times unbelievable life. Maybe there's a little bit of fiction in there, but all of his books have a surreal element, and they're very funny, and they're the kind of books that you can pick up and read any passage, and it's going to be delightful, funny, surprising, weird, and make you laugh. And also, if you do happen to be feeling any symptoms of anger or rage, I bet it will take you out of them, because Tom Robbins just has such a great positive outlook, attitude to life, making the best of things. At times he might be a little bit un-PC, it has to be said, in his attitude to women, but he is eternally life embracing, which is why I love him so much. And I'm just going to read you a little bit to get a flavour of his writing if you've never read him. That year, spring came to the Puget Sound country, as it frequently does, like a bridesmaid climbing a greased pole. After a gradual, precarious ascent, spring, in a triumph of frills and blooms and body heat, would seem to have finally arrived, only to suddenly slide down into the mud again, leaving winter's wet flag flapping stiffly and singularly at the top of the seasonal staff. Then, girlish bosom heaving, spring would shimmy slowly back up the pole. When Lee Cherry took to bed with her hangover, spring was riding high. She arose 2 days later to an unseasonal frost. It had numbed the bejeepers out of insects and buds. It had thrown the fear of February into batteries and birds. So inanimate was Prince Charming that Lee Cherry believed him deceased, although when the first sunbeam to drill through the window frost caused his flipper to twitch, she sat the terrarium in front of an open oven and watched as he stoically revived. It was the middle of April, except for the faithful, who were always sounding alarms about the return of the Ice Age. Nobody in the Pacific Northwest was prepared for such a frost. So, by the way, this book, I didn't ever say, is about, it's a kind of meditation on a packet of Camel cigarettes. And it is bizarre, funny, outrageous, ridiculous, and there's a lot of kind of meditational moments in it too. I'll just read what it says on the back. Still Life with Woodpecker is a sort of love story that takes place inside a pack of Camel cigarettes. It reveals the purpose of the moon, explains the difference between criminals and outlaws, examines the conflict between social activism and romantic individualism, and paints a portrait of contemporary society that includes powerful Arabs, exiled royalty, and pregnant cheerleaders. It also deals with the problem of redheads. That's me. So it's a really fun, crazy, ridiculous, great book. But one of the things I love most about it is the fact that it is a kind of meditation on a packet of Camel cigarettes. I used to smoke Camel cigarettes myself back in the day, and I also therefore feel quite close to the concept. But it's another reason why it's so good as a cure for anger and rage. The fact that it is meditating, it's taking you into a, an interesting piece of design, the packet of Camel cigarettes, and making you meditate on what the hell that fascinating image is. Catherine, I bet you used to smoke Camel cigarettes back in the day, surely. I did. I even wonder if they're still around. It's been so long since I smoked. But it's a really funny, crazy, great, excellent book, and it will make you laugh, take you out of any angry, rageful, and furious feelings that you're having. Tom Robbins, you can pick it up anytime, and he will make you laugh, I can practically guarantee. Now, another one which is a different kind of book, um, and much more recently written, Solar Bones by Mike McCormack, it was shortlisted for the Man Booker in 2017. This is an amazing book, which I feel not enough people have read. It is perhaps a slightly challenging in the way it's written because it is quite kind of stream of consciousness, possibly no punctuation at all, but it is compelling, and it all takes place in 1 hour of a man's life. It is a crisis in his life, and it might seem depressing if I tell you what it's about, but I'm not going to spoil it for you if I do. It is about a man dying, and it's the hour leading up to his death. Everything is packed into this hour. This whole book is packed into the hour of his death. But what's beautiful about it is the way you see everything about his life in that 1 hour. And it's a life full of joy and living and all sorts of wonderful things. And it makes you feel incredibly connected to nature, sunshine, solar bones, and everything that makes life joyous and wonderful. And I think that's why it's a great cure for anger, because it completely makes you want to seize the day, make the most of the good things about life, and not focus on anything negative. So I'm just going to read you a bit from it, um, and then you might get a sense of the writing style. Jesus, this fucking pain, this world of pain as my body burned, head to toe with molten current, which flared in the smallest molecule of my being. Pain like nothing I had ever felt before. Chest and arms engulfed, and my vision warped in blue depths of electrical waves as the light darkened. And I remember thinking in panicked despair that I'll just hang on to the pips and then the news headlines will come. So I'll listen to them for a few minutes. That's all I have to do, just listen to the reader. Tell me what's happening in the wider world, which lies outside this pain in my chest. Tell me the world is filled with strikes and pay disputes, that economic indicators continue to fall all over the place, that there are road deaths and stabbings, that there are car bombings in Baghdad and stalled offensives in Helmand, that a child is missing or that a body has been found, that accident and emergency wards are inundated, and that patients are lying on trolleys in hospital corridors, that the polls indicate that the courts have recognised and warrants have been issued, that there are disputed election results, but that someone has already declared themselves president for life, that legislation has finally been passed or has been referred to the Supreme Court, that the whole warp and weft of the world is ongoing, circumstances rising up and falling down, because if I knew that these things were still happening, still ongoing, however awful or distant they may be, then I would be happy to know that the world was about its proper business, and that I, as a citizen and engineer and still part of it all, and that no matter how far away these things may be, I would still have some stake in them simply by dint of drawing breath and raising a pulse and hearing about it on this car radio. I would have an involvement in these affairs, no matter how tenuous or tangential, because that was part of my circumstance as a man who took these things seriously, pain or no pain, fucking Jesus. So that it was essential now that I pay attention to kill this fire in my chest and give myself over to whatever I was now going to hear when sure enough, thank Christ, I heard the pips. Pip, 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 and so on. So that was actually a quite intense and you might say maybe even rageful moment of the book. But it very rapidly, so I've got a really itchy nose, very rapidly flips to a kind of celebration of the sun and the world, the birds that he can hear outside, and all the joyous and brilliant things about living. So, Solar Bones, a bit like reading The Old Man and the Sea, it is a book of great intensity and great celebration of the small, beautiful things. And it is intense. It does have sadness and pain, but it is a really life embracing book. I would then love to mention a couple more books. So, this is a good old classic. I think it was written in 1972 by Paddy Chayefsky. It's called Altered States. It was Paddy Chayefsky's only novel. He was a screenwriter and he wrote for TV. But this book was turned into a film of the same name, Altered States. Some of you might have seen it. It's actually a book that's a little bit hard to find. You have to find it. It's not in print anymore, and it absolutely should be because it's such a good read. And it is all about a man who is trying to move into a different plane of reality and connect himself with the subconscious of the universe, you might say. And I love it because it does take you into altered states yourself as a reader. And it makes you really believe that you can go into different states of consciousness where you might actually be connected with the rest of the universe. I did read this at a formative age, I must admit. I think I was probably about 13 when I first read it, but it holds up. It's still a really good read. I would just read you a little bit from the beginning so you can get a sense of the way it's written. Bethesda, Maryland, 1965. The isolation tank itself was nothing more than a coffin-like bathtub made of plywood and lined with aluminium, 8 by 8 by 10 feet, and half filled with a 10% solution of magnesium sulfate in water to increase buoyancy. The water was heated to 93 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which a floating body feels minimal gravity. Every morning, a volunteer from Andrews Air Force Base came by, stripped and stood there while a medical student from Johns Hopkins took blood samples and Jessup wired him up to all the EEG and EKG equipment. Heart rate, pulse, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response were tested. After this preparation, the subject climbed into the tank and floated. Jessup and his assistant placed the lid on the tank and went off to the monitoring room. Inside the tank, the volunteer subject floated in utter darkness and utter silence, effectively deprived of sensory stimulation, alone, isolated. So this book is all about what happens in the isolation tank, and it becomes a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde type book. I won't tell you what happens, but it is a really good read, and I feel that it's a great way of dealing with anger, rage, and fury because it shows you how you can go into a different state of mind through, well, they're using a flotation tank, but you as the reader go into that different state of mind because you're reading the book. And this is obviously something to mention that is very important in terms of bibliotherapy. Practically any book you read that is fiction is going to be a great cure for anger, rage, and fury because of that very fact. By reading the book, it will take you on a journey to a different place. It will alter your mind. So, to be honest, any book is going to be helping you with issues of anger and rage. But These books that I'm mentioning tonight are particularly brilliant. So I did want to also mention one that I feel is a great cure for anger and rage and fury, which is The Year of the Hare by Arto Pasolina, which is a book that I love and frequently recommend to people. It's a kind of cult book from Finland, written in 1974, about a man who is incredibly fed up with his life. He is middle aged, married, not very happy, a bit out of shape, not really sure where the hell his life is going. He's in his 50s. And one day he's driving on a work assignment through the forest and he accidentally hits a hare, which is the animal, the hare, and he with his car, and he accidentally injures that hare. And he gets out of the car, picks up the hare, and instead of doing what a normal person would probably do, which is to release the hare or even put it out of its misery, he decides to go off into the wilderness with the hare. And he then has a series of adventures with the hare in the forest, which are all perfectly believable until the end of the book. Won't tell you what happens. But the hare is just a hare. It's not a talking hare. It's not anthropomorphized at all. It doesn't become his kind of companion that talks back to him. It's just a hare. But they do form a bond and they have their adventures together. And the man, and he's called Levetnan, he goes through the wilderness, meeting all sorts of interesting people and staying in different places. And it's a kind of journey of self-discovery. And it's a great cure for anger and rage because when he hits the hare, you could say that's a kind of metaphor for the moment when his mind has changed. He's been in this sort of seething mini rage about his life, and then when he hits the hare, he changes his mind and becomes something else, like we do as we read the book. So when we're reading the book, we are taken into those forests of Finland and we go on this spontaneous adventure. And I think that's what the message of many of the books I'm talking about tonight is to do with, is the fact that you can read a book and it will change your mind, take you in a new direction, and show you different ways of being. So that's The Year of the Hare by Arto Pasolina, one of my favourite books that I like to recommend people. By the way, anyone here tonight, do tell me your favourite books which you think might help you with escaping from rage. What would you read, or anger, or fury? Maybe everyone should have The Year of the Hare sitting in their car so that if they have a moment of road rage, they should whip it out of the glove pocket, look at the cover, obviously not read it because you're driving, but just remember at that moment what the book was about, why you loved it, how instead of being in a fury, you could change your mindset and metaphorically go for a walk in the woods with your hare. I think it should be mentioned by the AA. Everyone needs Arto Pasolina in their glove pocket of their car or even stuck to the dashboard. Now, a different kind of rage quencher is the writer Benjamin Myers, who is an absolutely fantastic writer who I love all of his books. One of my favourites by him is The Great Golden Circle, which is a really fantastic book about crop circles. He also wrote The Offing, which is an absolute favourite of mine too, about a young man who meets an older woman who's a poet and she shows him the ways of poetry. This is short stories by Benjamin Myers called Male Tears, and they're all absolutely fantastic short stories, which are kind of united by being about men and issues relating to men. And I just think the first story, A Thousand Acres of English Soil, is an absolutely brilliant, quite short read. I think it's only kind of maybe 45 pages. Um, and it's one that everyone should read, and it will then be seared into your heart forever. I don't want to tell you what happens because it is one of those stories that is a bit of a shock when the resolution comes. But one of the things I love about Benjamin Meyer's writing is that it's all set in the very British countryside, and it really celebrates the joys of the British countryside. And you can't help but feel the soil in your fingers when you're reading one of his books. And this is very much true, as you can imagine, with a title like that, A Thousand Acres of English Soil. It's about a farmer who is ploughing his field, and there's a mega drama in the story, which I will not tell you what happens. But it's kind of really satisfying because it is a terrible thing that happens. So if you are feeling really furious and angry about something, you would kind of enjoy the horror of the moment in this story, because sometimes it's really great to read something awful so as to have that cathartic feeling of something horrible happening. And that really does happen in this book, in this story. But it's also got a really great positive sense of circularity and of you reap what you sow. So I'll just read you a little bit of it. For people that don't know the writing of Benjamin Myers, it will give you a little sample so that you can hear his voice. The hare is on its haunches and sniffing the air when the man enters the middle field. It watches from a distance with its ears tilted to the breeze, and then, when the man stumbles on the rutted edge of soil, it turns and runs away at half speed. The man sees the white smudge of its rump bouncing over stubble. He's always thought it nature's cruel irony to place a target on such a stealthy creature, a mark of imperfection to prevent it evolving beyond its capabilities. He pauses and watches as the hare takes long strides towards the safety of the hedgerow's shadows at the far edge of the field, the taut sinews of its legs flexing. He's been raised to believe that the sighting of the season's first hare is symbolic, though he cannot remember for certain whether it represents good or ill fortune. As a man of the soil and the woods and the holloways, his inclination is towards the latter. He reads the hare as a portent. Maybe he's right to do that, but I won't tell you what happens. So Male Tears, really great collection of short stories, and that first one I do think is particularly fab, and one that really would help you with rage and fury. Thinking again of humour as a way to cope with feelings of rage and anger. Everyone has different kinds of books that they find funny. Carl Hiaasen is one of my favourite authors from Florida. Um, he is always hilarious. He writes for kids as well. He's written young adult books too. And he always has just fantastic characters. He's almost always got a kind of eco message in his books. And there's normally quite a few ridiculous baddies in his stories who do get their comeuppance in a really satisfying way. They're often quite extreme caricatures of themselves, of humans. They're kind of Dickensian in their grotesquerie, and that's also one of the fun aspects of Carl Hiaasen. A bit like, I have to say, Tom Robbins, who I was mentioning earlier, who's also one to quite celebrate the grotesque in life. But I'll just read you what is on the back of this Carl Hiaasen novel. Joey Perrone is a woman with a mission. She's just been pushed overboard from a cruise liner by Chaz, her scumbag husband, and survived to tell the tale. But rather than reporting him to the police, she decides to stay dead. And, with a little help from her friends and a few of Chaz's enemies, instead of getting mad, she's going to get even. Then the blurb says Carl Hiaasen is the undisputed master of organised chaos. His satire is a fierce, unmuzzled snarl swiftly followed by a painfully ironic bite. Quite simply brilliant. So, this is a great example of Carl Hyarsen's work. I think he's incredibly funny, and a lot of other people do. He is always very satirical about the state of America. He's always got a great eco message, and his characters are just fantastic. I love their awfulness, and they always end up getting what they deserve, one feels. So the goodies come out well, and the baddies get pulverized in various different ways. So that's a fun read. And I was thinking a good way of dealing with anger is to make yourself laugh. So different people have different types of books that make themselves laugh. I think High Arson is pretty much guaranteed to make you laugh. But if not him, then there's always Douglas Adams. Surely he is capable of rescuing anyone from a furious moment just by picking up the book and opening a page of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or even just thinking about the book will do it for you too. That's why reading is so great. Once you've read a book, it's in your head forever, and you just have to think about it for a second, and it will change the way you feel. That's why books are a uniquely portable magic. Uh, on a different note, just thinking again of different ways to tackle rage and anger, um, Angela Carter is a rather fantastic writer who maybe isn't read as much as one would hope she should be nowadays. She wrote the absolutely brilliant collection of short stories, The Bloody Chamber, which are kind of different takes on fairy tales, sometimes with a modern twist. And she's also written an amazing collection of fairy tales from around the world that she's collated and then um, retold. But this book, The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, is a completely surreal, crazy, bizarre, excellent story. Um, First published in 1972, hailed as one of the best surrealist novels in the English language. And it's about Desiderio, who is stricken with love for Albertina, a woman he sees only in his dreams. He must also battle against Dr. Hoffman and his mysterious machines as they bend time and space to turn Desiderio City into a nightmare of lust, insanity, and crime. But the evil doctor is also Albertina's father. So that is The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, a very surreal, bizarre, hilarious, and crazy book, which, if you pick up, I can definitely say you will start to chortle and be amazed. It has elements of freakishness in it as well, and it's just bizarre and brilliant. One must definitely mention, while talking about Rage and Fury, Natalie Haynes's fantastic book, Medusa, in which Medusa is raised by the Furies on an island, and you actually fall in love with the Furies in her book because they're really relatable and charming in a way, in their scary, extremely taloned way. But the way that they nurture Medusa and love her is a way that makes you see the Furies in a whole different light. But so you look at the idea of fury in a different way when reading about these mythological figures in Natalie Haynes's book, Stone Blind. Sorry, I might have called it Medusa. It's about Medusa, but it's called Stone Blind. And Natalie Haynes also clearly has a deep interest in the Furies because they come in not only into that book, but also into her book, A Thousand Ships, which is absolutely brilliant as well, all about the Odyssey, but told through the women's eyes of the Odyssey. And um, one more book by Natalie Haynes, which I love too, is The Amber Fury, which I think might have been her first novel, which is all about a young woman who is a theatre, a drama teacher, who teaches some kids who have behavioral issues, and they reenact one of the Greek tragedies, and there's an element of Greek tragedy that does overlap into the modern world, which I won't tell you because it's a really good read, and it is also a big surprise when it happens. So that's The Amber Fury by Natalie Haynes, another book which I totally love. So nearly coming to the end of this session all about what to read to overcome feelings of anger, rage, and fury. But I would just like to mention this one, The Comforts of Madness by Paul Sayer, which is a very slim, interesting, and in some ways quite difficult read. I think it was published in 1988, won various awards. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's about a man who, in a way, is so furious with the world that he literally becomes catatonic. He's had an absolutely terrible childhood and upbringing, and he has had such an awful time that he decides to stop moving completely. That's his eye as he's looking out from where he lies in a hospital on the world, completely catatonic, now unable to move because he's been not moving deliberately since he was about 11 years old. So it's a really tragic and depressing concept, and maybe a book not to read if you are actually feeling quite depressed. I just like to point out, but a good one to read if you're feeling angry or furious, because it is a book that in a way shows what happens when you take anger and fury to an extreme degree, to a point where you can't escape from them. So I think that might be the last of the books I'm mentioning tonight. We've had a bit of Benjamin Myers, Male Tears, amazing short stories. Altered States by Paddy Chayefsky, all about going into different states of mind. He uses a flotation tank. Other people nowadays might be more likely to use microdoses of mushrooms, maybe. We've got The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman. Tom Robbins, using his humour and his amazing ability to meditate to take us out of ourselves into a different state. Solar Bones, about the death of a man, but it actually really celebrates life. Leonard and Hungry Paul, beautiful book all about living in a more quiet way. A Gentleman in Moscow, which shows how someone who by rights ought to be in an utter fury manages to overcome his circumstances and still remain noble, charming, and fabulous. And The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, as well as Carl Hiaasen. Not sure if I mentioned that. So thanks so much for joining me this evening. If anyone has any thoughts on other topics they'd like me to cover, please do let me know. And I'm going to be interviewing next week, I do believe and hope, the fabulous Antoine Laurent about his new book, An Astronomer in Love. So that'll be next Wednesday, live, only on Instagram, not on Facebook, because I can't do an interview on Facebook unless someone tells me how to do it. So thanks so much for coming. Don't forget, you can always book a bibliotherapy session for yourself or a friend via my website, ellabear2.com. And I will see you again next week. Good night.